Rebecca Smith and John Emschwiller are beat reporters for the Wall Street Journal. 24 Days is their chronicle of the Enron story. This talk lasts an hour.
Let's start with John. Rebecca, who wants to go first? Let's start with John. This is John Emschwiller, and he's the national correspondent. And I think your focus of coverage is white-collar crime.
Yeah, that's been the focus of coverage for most of the last 10 years, chasing around swindlers.
At the Wall Street Journal. So when you see those pictures of those executives doing the perp walk, I think you're
Some of my
responsible.
friends.
You're responsible. They're your friends. So, sounds like
Well, my sources.
Getting too cozy with your sources.
Well, at least not handcuff cozy.
And yeah, you don't want to get that close.
Right.
Anyway, let me just leave the introduction brief like that. And with that, John, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to stand up. I think I was told I could do that. I can't. So I think better when I pace. I write a lot when I walk around. But if I do trip and make a fool of myself, don't hold against the book, please, or my co-author. I'm really happy to be here tonight. It's a pleasure. I'm particularly happy to be here in the Tabard Inn because 20 years ago, when I was a much younger reporter, I used to stay here whenever I could. It's a wonderful old place. And I have a vague recollection about this place, although it's long enough. I could be wrong, and I could be wrong about the hotel or the city, but I'm pretty sure it was this country, that they used to have a bar downstairs, an open bar, where you could actually pour your own drinks, and then you sort of write down that, you know, what you wrote, what you drank, and it was an honor system, and you'd pay on your bill at the end, which I thought was great. But I was worried about the place because everybody I knew who stayed here was either a newspaper reporter or a labor activist. And I figured this is a road to insolvency for this poor place. I'm glad to see that prognostication was wrong. Although, if Rebecca, when she talks, she can probably tell you I had many predictions about Enron that were completely wrong, so I have a good track record on that. The book we did, I think, was a little bit different in approach than you'd normally do as journalists. We put ourselves in as characters, as you'll see in the book. And that was in a somewhat, well, it was one of the first chances Becky and I had for vigorous debate about how to do this book. We did it for several reasons, and partly because, and there's a pragmatic reason, that we knew there were going to be half a dozen or more Enron books out, and that there are going to be many of them very similar. So we thought, well, at least this is a different approach to take. More importantly, though, we thought through a combination of some work on our part and luck, and there was certainly a lot of luck, we were in an unusual position to watch what happened. We sort of felt like we were in some ways the front seat of a roller coaster that was on this wild and crazy ride. And that really turned out to be a sort of fulcrum point in American business history. Most of you, I'm sure, remember the 90s, when there seemed to be no direction but up, and every wacko idea could be taken to market and turned into a multi-billion-dollar company, at least in the marketplace. And Enron, that was Enron's decade, the 1990s. And indeed, Enron was viewed as one of those companies, one of those old line companies that had somehow gotten the message of the new economy in the 21st century and had transformed itself into this new economy company. And then in the space of really what, as our book title says, 24 days, from October 16th, 2001 to November 8th, 2001, Enron was transformed from this paradigm of the 21st century economy into sort of the symbol of corporate greed, excess, scandal, corruption that has sort of now taken on, Enron's become the sort of word for an entire era of actions that, the country sort of finds disgusting and reprehensible. And so we wanted to try, and we were fortunate enough to sort of go along on that journey. And we were hoping that by trying to take the readers along on that same journey, we could give them some sense of the excitement, but also some sense of the issues that were being raised as this, rather rapid, almost incredibly rapid at times, series of events were unfolding. So that's one reason we put ourselves in as characters to this book. What we did, journalists every day do. I mean, in some senses, there was nothing really extraordinary about what we did. We got some clues, like reporters often get. Ours first came on August 15th, 2001. Jeff Skilling had resigned the day before. Now, most of you probably know Jeff Skilling. He was the chief executive officer of Enron at the time and the sort of wunderkind of the company. He was 47 years old. He'd had a meteoric rise at Enron up over a 10-year period, gone from Harvard Business School and a partner at McKinsey and Company. As he liked to point out, the youngest partner, the youngest managing director at McKinsey. Although he'd sometimes qualify and say, well, I was tied for the youngest with Lou Gerstner, I think it was. And so he gets this job in February of 2001. It looks like he's going to have a 10, 15-year run. He's being lauded in all the magazines. He's on the cover of most business magazines. Comes August 14th, 6 months into his tenure, he quits. And he says, I'm quitting for personal reasons. Of course, most people who have ever covered corporations figure that the only personal interest a CEO has is holding on to his job. And so nobody really believed Ken Lay, excuse me, that's another one that I'd have to do with. Jeff Skilling. But nobody really had the goods to say, well, you're lying, or that's not true. And nobody really knew the true reason. So we did a story that first day that basically laid out what they said. Then the next day we did a follow-up story. And I was asked to do the story, and so I did what reporters often do. I didn't know a lot about the company, so one, I put a call in and I said, can I talk to Skilling again? Because I figured, well, it can't hurt. You talk to him and maybe he'll say something more. They rarely do, but you never know. And so the request went into the maw of Enron and started getting processed. And while I was waiting to hear back whether there was going to be any response, I did what reporters again often do. You go over to the SEC filings for the company. God bless the SEC. And it turned out that the day before, they had made their second quarter financial filing, their so-called 10Q. And so I pulled it up from 10K Wizard and started reading through it. And long ago, when I started out as a Wall Street Journal reporter, I won't tell you how long ago, but it was taught to me how to read an SEC filing quickly when you didn't have a lot of time, but you needed to try to check something. You go to the litigation section, because it's always good to know who's suing who. You know, if it's a year-end statement, you go and see what the auditor's statement says to see if there's any qualifications. Looking in retrospect, the idea of Arthur Andersen putting a qualification on Enron is probably absurd, but nonetheless, you'd go look there. And then you also go to what's called the related party transaction section, because it's sort of the corporate dirty linen. You know, if the idiot nephew gets the vice president's job, if the chairman's idiot nephew or the director gets a consulting job, that's where they have to put it in. And I think one of the problems, reporters generally, all of us, we don't read things like SEC filings enough, because there's a huge storehouse of information sitting there. The internet has made it incredibly available that you can literally in seconds go through tens of thousands of documents with a search engine to find things. And it's one of the things I don't think we do enough of as journalists. So I went through this thing and was reading, trying to pick up things and not getting much. And then I come across in the related party section this references to all these partnerships run by some unnamed senior executive who the company said partly owned the partnerships and was doing hundreds of millions of dollars of business with Enron. I mean, I've read a lot of related party transaction sections in SEC filings over the years, and I'd never seen anything quite like that. And of course, my first thought, okay, the senior executive quit the partnerships 2 weeks ago. Jeff Skilling quit yesterday. I bet that's Jeff Skilling. Maybe that's why he quit. So I thought, I got a scoop here. So I call Enron up, all excited, and I get this chief PR man. He says, oh, no, that's Andy Fastow. And of course, I was so well versed in the company by that point, I said, who's Andy Fastow? And he sort of, gives me this kind of tolerant, oh, he's our chief financial officer, like I was sort of an idiot child. And, oh, yeah, we've been reporting that for 2 years. It's old. There's nothing to it. The board approved it. It's perfectly fine. So I'm deflated. I think, God, no story there. And I still had a story to write that night. Because reporters, of course, editors, we always have a story to write that night, and the deadline keeps rolling towards you. And then Jeff Skilling calls. He calls back. And I got to tell you, it was the strangest interview I ever had in my life, at least with a senior executive. I mean, I've had some pretty strange interviews with white-collar criminals, but they're semi-psychotic, so they don't count. But the Skilling was sounding like, usually these guys sound like masters of the universe. In complete control, there he is, everything's assured, everything's fine. And that was Skilling to a T when he was CEO. I mean, he had a reputation for self-confidence that bordered way over into arrogance. He once called a critic in front of like 200 or 300 analysts on a conference call an asshole right in front of everybody, which got him all kinds of publicity. But this interview with Skilling, he sounded depressed. I mean, it was a very bizarre interview. And he starts like, at the end, almost talking to himself. He's like muttering, well, if the stock price had only stayed up, I could still be there. And I don't know what he's talking about, but it's very bizarre. And I finally say, I mean, Mr. Skilling, if the stock price hadn't fallen, and Enron's stock price, I say, like by then had fallen maybe 50%, like most of the market had been sliding for a year and a half. And I asked him, you mean if this had stayed up, you'd still be the CEO? Because the day before he said, personal reasons, nothing to do with the company. And I asked the question, there's this pause, and this like little boy voice comes back and says, yeah, I guess so. So we think, well, we got a story tonight at least. I mean, the guy, maybe he's a lunatic, but at least we have a story tonight. So we write that story. And that was one of our first signs. It was, why was he so obsessed with the stock price? We couldn't figure that out. And then we see these partnerships. And, Fastow had quit the partnerships, but they still smelled, And partly you sometimes write things in a newspaper because even if you think it's kind of old, you think it should be put on the public record. They should at least be embarrassed enough that it's there in a place like the Wall Street Journal so that they didn't just do something kind of scummy without anybody noticing. So Rebecca and I decided about 2 weeks later, we had another story to do on Enron, basically where Ken lay, who had been running the company officially for 15 years, although we later found out he was like the captain down in the stateroom the whole time and never was up at the steerage. We did a story where he was going to go with the company. And we mentioned the partnerships, the so-called LJM partnerships for the first time. Now, we didn't really know what we had, and showing what in retrospect is not particularly prescient news judgment. We actually just put it in the second half of the story because sort of sticking it at the end, and it's lucky they didn't cut that. But that mention was enough to get a phone call. And it's one of those phone calls that reporters dream about getting and almost never get. Somebody with inside knowledge, even better, inside documents, and a willingness to talk. A reasonable, rational person who actually could lay out to us a large part of what was going on inside these partnerships. And this person didn't have everything, but they had enough to give us a beginning, a road to follow. So, these first clues, Skilling's weird interview, the mention of the partnerships, led us to a second, a third, bigger clue, this person giving us these documents. And then we started, pulling that string, which is what reporters do. You sort of pull along, and we've all done it. And, 99 times out of 100, maybe you'll get a decent story or you get no story. But we kept pulling on this one, and it kept turning into a bigger and bigger story. And there was a lot of frustration. We had a lot of dead ends. I remember those first few weeks we would call people, and no one wanted to talk about Enron. No one wanted to talk about the LJM partnerships who were involved in them. I remember talking to one bank who wouldn't talk to me, but they wanted to make sure if I did put their name in the paper as a lender to Enron, they wanted me to be sure to say that they're very happy doing business with Enron and would like to do more. And I had to inform them that if they wanted to do that, they should call the advertising department of the Wall Street Journal and not me. But it was a sign of how much power and fear and respect that Enron generated in the business world. And so we were going along, chasing down these things. We were obviously, like most American journalism, diverted by 9/11. I mean, for 2 or 3 weeks, nobody really at the Journal, I think most other major papers, did anything but terrorism-related stories. We get back to the story in early October, still trying to track down enough on these partnerships to write a big story, but not yet having enough. Then Enron announces its third quarter earning results on October 16th. It was really the beginning of the 24 days. It was a classic Enron day because Enron, they put out a headline, recurring earnings up 26%. What are recurring earnings? I mean, it's corporate happy talk that grew like mad in the 1990s. What they didn't say at the headline was down sort of in the body of the story. They also took a $1 billion charge, which gave them the biggest loss in their history. But the market, like the market often did in the 90s, sort of shrugged that off, and Enron stock actually went up for the day. That series of events started us writing a we wrote our first story about LJM the next day, really, where we started putting out some of the inside stuff, thinking we better get this out because part of that write-off was due to LJM. We were starting to get worried that other people would start picking up on LJM, so we decided to put out what we could prove and knew. And that really started a chain of events, at least for us, and I think for the company, that just picked up speed. You know, and then one of the things that Enron happened to them is they always prided themselves on their ability to manipulate and handle the press, and they were really good at it. Suddenly, everything was like reversed on them. So everything they did in those 24 days, instead of working to their benefit, backfired on them. You know, poor Ken Lay sitting there on October 23rd in a conference call, basically wrapping his arms around Andy Fastow, 100% confidence in him. Next day, he's fired. Doesn't exactly do a lot for the guy's, credibility. So we try in the book to sort of go through those events and try to sort of, we hope, carry along some of the excitement we felt and the almost awe and wonder about what was happening with this company that culminated in probably the most extraordinary SEC filing I've ever seen on November 8th, where the company, tells the world, well, we're renouncing 4 years of audited financial statements, we're taking $600 million of loss, renouncing $600 million of earnings that we already reported, hundreds of millions of dollars of additional debt. Oh yeah, we're firing 2 senior officials who were, improperly profiting from partnerships, and it was the death knell of Enron. And that's the one reason when we saw the 24th day. Enron didn't actually go bankrupt for another few weeks, but the Enron that was sort of the dream, the Enron that had so wowed the American investing public, the American press, Wall Street, by November 8th it was dead. And the company faced really 2 choices at that point. It could be bought by another company, which it tried to do with Dynegy, or it could go into bankruptcy court, which it eventually did on December 2nd. And, from then on, Enron's future was basically become sort of a symbol for all that was bad in American corporate life. And so that's a rough sort of synopsis of the narration of the book and how it sort of unfolded. And I'll be glad to answer more questions, and you get Becky now. But thank you. I didn't trip.
The questions will trip you up later.
I'll be sitting for those.
Rebecca Smith, you're in the Los Angeles bureau of the Wall Street Journal, and she is she's their energy reporter, and in fact you've been covering energy for a while,
right,
even before the Wall Street Journal, and so this is a good time for you to be covering energy, and why don't you go ahead and say a little bit more about the book.
Okay. I'm already tripping on the wire. As John said, it's a lot of fun to be here tonight. Thank you so much for coming out in the middle of a week when there are a lot of other things you could be doing right now. John has given you kind of the rough synopsis of what the Enron story was for us as reporters. But I think that we're at a point in time now, we are, after all, more than a year after the bankruptcy filing, when it's appropriate for all of us to say, what did the Enron story mean to us as a society? Was it just another blip in capitalism? Does it have some meaning? Are there some lessons that the Enron story imparts that we should be paying attention to, things we should have learned from? Teddy Roosevelt, in his autobiography, says, Americans only learn from catastrophe and not from experience. We have here both catastrophe and a lot of experience in emerging markets, and I think we ought to have learned something from it. So what might those things be? And I'll give you just a few personal reflections. About a week ago, I got a copy of our book, 24 Days, in the mail, and it was kind of exciting to open up an envelope and actually see the manuscript had somehow miraculously transformed itself into a book. And I had the book sitting in the coffee table of our home, and my 12-year-old daughter and a friend of hers were over, and they were bouncing around the living room doing various things, and they suddenly focused on the book and sat down and opened it, and they were looking at the pictures. And then out of the blue, and my daughter, of course, has been around, she's seen big pieces of the last year completely eaten up, vacations that never happened, evenings where I was on the computer, weekends when I was at work. So she understands what the toll is. But she realized that she didn't really understand what Enron was all about. And so she looked at me and said, Mom, what was it that Enron did that was so bad? And, you know, we often in newspapers think we were told in journalism school to write to the 8th grade level. Now I'm in the position of explaining to the 7th grade level what it was that Enron did. And I know I can't talk about share-settled costless collars. I can't talk about derivative transactions or hedging techniques. I can't talk about mark-to-market accounting. I can't reach into this bag of tricks and pull out any of these tools that I've become accustomed to using over the past year. How do I explain to a 12-year-old? So I said, well, you know, it's pretty simple. Enron did a lot of really dumb things, and they never were willing to admit it. And that is the Enron story in essence. If you don't learn from your mistakes, if you don't admit your mistakes, you can't learn from your mistakes. And Enron, rather than say, okay, we blew $2 billion on broadband, we blew billions on utilities in Latin America that weren't worth it because we were in a white-hot heat to get in on the privatization movement. We spent a lot of money in markets that we didn't really understand. They could never admit the mistakes. Instead, they devised elaborate structures for sucking in money from whatever source they could through partnerships, through the big banks, through any means they could, and keeping the whole thing afloat. And they blew through billions of dollars in the process that they didn't have, and eventually it all came back at them. Enron is like the proverbial turtle on a fence post. You don't know how it got there, but you know it didn't get there alone. It had a lot of help in getting to where it wound up. And that, for me, was lesson number 2 for the 12-year-olds. Think about the friendships you form. Friends help make you a better person. They don't take you in the other direction. And if you have friends who are really there to make huge fee income off of you and to close in at the end of quarters and help you concoct yet another group of deals that'll help you report profits for that quarter, these are not your friends. These are sycophants. I mean, we have other words for these relationships. Enron didn't realize that. I don't think these individuals realized that. We see Arthur Andersen, of course, the big accounting firm, was completely destroyed over its relationship with Enron. So the cost has been enormous, both to that company, to investors, to the accounting profession, to the legal profession, to investment bankers, even people who had nothing to do with this company and who are people of, you know, upright character have been sullied by it. So that, for me, was lesson number 2. Think about your friendships and what these relationships are you form, because they are meaningful. We all kind of understand. There's one incident that we describe in the Enron book I've thought about quite a bit lately, which is we describe a scene in which Ben Glisson, who's this ambitious, he eventually becomes the treasurer of Enron, but he's described by several people as being a kind of a Boy Scout. He's this shiny, enthusiastic, bright, energetic young guy who comes to Enron at a fairly young age. And there's a scene with him in 1999 when they're trying to figure out a way out of their problems. And he's in a meeting with Jeff Skilling and some others. And they're saying, you know, we got to come up with a structure that'll help us out of a problem we're in right now. And what they eventually come up with is something that becomes known as the Raptors. These were 4 vehicles that boosted Enron's results by more than $1 billion in the end. And you can understand how this happens. This is kind of the engineering problem. You know, we got a problem, let's fix it. Bill Thompson, who does book reviews, we were talking with today, and we were kicking things around with him, and he said, so it's like the guy who he's called in to fix the counterfeiting machine in the basement, right? And all he says is, okay, I've got a problem. I've got to fix the counterfeiting machine. And he never thinks about what it is that this machine is doing, and is it legal? Is it right? And that's the kind of a cycle that Enron was in. At that meeting where the Raptors were conceived, there should have been someone who said, aren't we hoodwinking the public through this? Aren't we lying to our investors? Should we really be going in this direction? And that doesn't happen because they're solving the engineering problem that's been put in front of them. I've been reading a lot of classics in the last year, trying to get to books that I never got to when I was younger. And one of the books that I've been reading with a lot of satisfaction is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which may be, after the Bible, the book that's been printed more widely in English than any other. Yet, how many of us would think of that as a book that business press or business people should be reading? But there's a scene in that fairly early in the book when, this is a Protestant tract about this young man striving to reach redemption or salvation. I mean, it's very theologically based. And he encounters early in his journey a man, he's heavily burdened. He's trying to stick to the straight and narrow, and he's finding it very difficult to stay on the path. And a man comes up to him who's described as Mr. Worldly Wise Man, because, of course, this is allegorical, who says, what you're doing is way too hard, and it's totally unnecessary. If you will go to that city over there, there's a man there who can help you. He is very clever about finding solutions to problems, and he will lighten your burden. And his name is Mr. Legality. So the young man, of course, because the straight and narrow is too difficult, he goes to the city and he's trying to find the house, and he finds this is an enormous hill. And it appears that the whole hill is on the verge of coming down on his head, and he's afraid to scale it because it looks so ominous. And at that point, another man who is part of helping him, the pilgrim, reach the just end, encounters him and says, "Why were you going this direction? Didn't I tell you that even this way may look harder, but in the end it gets you where you want to get. That way doesn't." So, there's something kind of, I think our forefathers and foremothers, they read these things, they thought about temptations and corrupting influences, they accepted that they were there, and we have an inclination now to think, well, it's just part of what you need to do to fit in the business world, So anyway, to sum up, I think there are some good lessons in the Enron story. I think the more broadly we think of them, the more useful it is. And that's what I hope happens. One always hopes for reform and progress and good outcomes from bad experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have some time for questions, and so I hope those of you who have them will share them. I got one quick question before we get started, and that is, this is for Rebecca and John. What's the one thing in the book that you hope the readers take away with it, from it? I mean, if the reader takes away one thing from it, what do you hope that will be?
Personal responsibility. I mean, that is the reason why we read books. I mean, we have to get something useful to our own lives. We have to think about what the corporate culture is, or the agency culture, or whatever the cultural group that we're running with. What is it trying to do, and are we really part of it? Are we helping it achieve a good end?
I think there's also, one of the most disturbing things about the Enron story is, in some ways how Enron was so much like so many other companies. It wasn't really a renegade. There was a reason Enron was one of the most respected companies in America for a decade. And because it fit into a whole era of American thinking and business. And so I think, we have to sort of take a broader look at, what is sort of valued in this society. Because in the 90s, we really started valuing fairly ephemeral things. And we really did think that there was a free lunch, and we really did think that things too good to be true could be true. I mean, the internet revolution was part of that. I mean, there is a real revolution going on, but much of what was going on Wall Street was complete blarney. And Enron was sort of a child of that period. And so in some ways, what struck me most about Enron was how much it was a product of its times and not a renegade.
I think one of the real strengths of both your writing articles together is the focus to what you do. There's a logical progression, and the quotes are not gratuitous. A lot of articles that were written were just lots of stuff about Enron of any different type. I was interested, what was your process in how you decided what you would use and not use? And also, is there anything gratuitous you didn't put in there you could share with us?
It's all in the book.
Yeah, we threw that all in the book. Well, we tried to be very careful, in part because the journal's culture is a culture that's very conservative and very careful about what you say, because it's very cognizant of the power it has in business affairs.
Yeah, and fairness.
And fairness. and that sort of goes hand in hand. I mean, so I think we tried to be very careful, and we also, you got to remember, most of the time we were writing in those early days, we were still looking at Enron as a very big and respectable company. You know, we thought, well, maybe there's some strange things going on. Maybe Andy Fastow has a deal that's sort of feathering his own financial nest. But we didn't realize, like the rest of the world didn't really realize, that there was a deeper, pervasive rot inside of Enron that was really like a cancer, a fatal cancer. So we tried to be, for many reasons, very careful. And I think we can look back sometimes on our coverage and, people say, gee, couldn't you have said more in that story? Even though at the time it seemed like we were really kind of pushing into new ground, it seemed to us. But yeah, we would often not put stuff in the paper for days on end because we hadn't gotten it nailed down enough yet. I remember at one point Becky had this almost bizarre conversation with the head of public relations. Remember about about whether they'd given a waiver of the conflict of interest policy, and we had these partnership documents that said Andy Fastow had been given a waiver from the board of directors for the conflict of interest policy, which, presumably said you shouldn't do anything against the interests of your company. And the PR man initially said, yeah, that's true. And then he calls back 15, 20 minutes later and says, well, no, I was wrong. It's really that the board of directors looked at what he was doing at LJM and decided there wasn't a conflict of interest, so we didn't have to give a waiver. And that's a big difference.
A blatant breach of fiduciary duty was judged not to have been a conflict of interest.
But we didn't run. We pulled it out of the story that night in part because, the company was adamant about its position, and we only had it on one document, from an unnamed source. So we said we got to get some more confirmation for that. So we pulled it out of the story, and we did that on more than one occasion.
But there's also sometimes what you do put in can be so illuminating, and you can wind up feeling such gratitude. For example, the first story we did that talked about the executive-run partnerships ran as a Heard on the Street column at the end of August in 2001. And this is where you just feel gratitude to the journal for 100 years of building credibility and for having a really wonderful national readership. Because we quoted in there the gobbledygook that was contained in one of Enron's SEC filings. It made no sense. And we pointed out that there was this conflict problem. And what that elicited then was this first trove of absolutely invaluable inside documents. And what that demonstrated to me was there were a lot of people inside the company who thought, this stuff is wrong. What's wrong with me that I'm not with the program? They'd be in the meeting after meeting where these things were being talked about as if it was okay. And they would leave the meeting thinking, I don't fit in. When they saw it in the journal, when they saw that the Wall Street Journal felt there were problems, suddenly they felt it was okay to feel what they'd been feeling. And that opened things up. So that
okay to act on it and actually call somebody.
They needed that confirmation.
Because it is, for anybody inside a company, a frightening and dangerous thing to go outside the confines of the company, either to the government or to the press, and say, I found something that's not right.
And you need that reassurance from someone that it's okay.
Okay, we have several questions, and you were the first, so why don't you go ahead?
I have a journal, in the interest of full disclosure, I was a reporter for the Journal for 6 years.
And she used to buy me drinks, so.
He used to buy me drinks. Well, not here. Becky, you just mentioned the Heard on the Street column, and since this is a reporting crowd, I have a question related to the peculiar culture inside the Journal. And I know there's a lot of pressure on reporters to get onto page one and also a lot of editing on page one. And if you're not there with the story, it may not be quite as important. And I'm curious, was there a lot of pressure internally from journal editors if you weren't producing a leader for page one? And also, how was competition at the time? Because that can also affect the editor's decision.
We were not pushed initially to produce stories for page one. In fact, I don't think, eventually when the story becomes a big story and all the other papers are piling on, and then you go through this really hideous experience of packed journalism. At that point, everything changes. But initially, in the beginning, we had this really wonderful running start because of the sources that were so kind and kept bringing things out. By the time it was clear that Enron was losing 5% or 10% of its value per day, and that it was going down, 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 and all the other papers piled on, at that point, then, you know, I don't think we were ever pushed prematurely to produce anything for Page One. It was more like we were just trying to keep up with the pace of events themselves.
I mean, when we got those first set of documents, there was a recognition that there could be a big story, that we still had a long way to go because it was basically some documents and a bunch of fairly explosive allegations from this source about what was going on inside of Enron, but we had no confirmation. So we immediately talked to our editors, and they were interested in a possible Page One piece. And as Christy knows from being at the Journal, that's sort of the ultimate place to get, is on the front page of the Journal in one of those, what we call leaders.
And that's partly explain one thing. You have more space. You could tell a bigger story because you simply get more column inches.
And you also just,
I mean, the placement's
and you
obviously
obviously
better,
get more readership too. Although the Herd gets a lot of readership as well, which is in the third section of the paper. So we were working with the hope in those first few weeks after we first got these documents, which really be like early September through early mid-October, with that kind of hiatus because of 9/11. And actually, Becky and I had a little debate, although not much, on the 16th when the earnings came out, because I still was hoping, having been at the Wall Street Journal longer than her, I always had more of an attachment to Page One stories. And, you know, thinking, well, should we throw what we have into this night's story? Should we try to hold it on the hope that nobody else picks it up? And Becky was, pretty strongly, we should put it in.
Shovel.
And our bureau chief was the same, and I did agree with him, although I just had some trepidation, thinking, well, maybe we could hold it and, get a bigger story. So we decided to throw everything in, but no, there was no pressure in that sense, you got to hold it for Page One. If anything, they wanted to, once it became clear that things were starting to break, they said, get stuff in the paper as fast as you can. We'll keep giving you space, and when it gets on Page One, if it does, it'll get there, but don't worry about where it goes, just get stuff. And as far as the competition, as Becky mentioned, we were fortunate, having that source, those documents, the leads that produced gave us a big lead because nobody else was looking at that stuff then. And even on the 16th, when they came out with this record loss, the press didn't much, react to it. The New York Times did a piece about the loss. The Post, had it in a roundup, like a one-paragraph mention in a roundup. The LA Times, which is a fine newspaper and did, a lot of great coverage of business in California, didn't even do a story, which was a little odd because Enron had been this, pretty big thing in the California electricity crisis, but they didn't actually do a story the next day. So there wasn't a lot of interest in Enron as of October 16th in the press beyond the kind of normal corporate coverage. And so we were lucky in that sense that we had the field, we had a lead, and we also had the field to ourselves for the first week or so. And in a story that goes on for months and months, that lead evaporates, because when you get enough good journalists chasing a story, you're not going to keep the lead. They're going to start beating you on stuff. It's just inevitable. The thing about Enron, of course, is that the thing collapsed really in 24 days. So the other guys and women had a hard time gearing up in time to really, by the time this happened. It was just so sudden.
Go back to you.
Yeah, I was interested, John, before you started talking about the ephemeral nature of both Enron and the tech bubble. It was on my mind to ask you if there was a connection, because they did happen pretty much, or the tech burst pretty much happened right around the same time. And the thing that was going through my mind is this smoke and mirrors thing about being compensated with something that isn't really compensation, and selling something, as Enron did, that you don't really have. And it all, now Fastow brings up a different piece of it, because he's, to my mind, the evildoer, the one who was out for himself. And I didn't conceive of Skilling in that way, though maybe he was. But
well,
I guess the lesson that I'm looking for is, is there somewhere else, are there other stones that we should be turning over? Where are some other areas where the whole concept behind it is so ephemeral that maybe there's another good story there.
Well, that's a good question, and we know that there are thousands of these so-called special purpose entities out there in the corporate world. These are these off-balance sheet entities that have been around for a long time and can often be used in very legitimate ways. But again, it's the question of how you start using them and what degree. And Enron kept getting more and more aggressive, creative, until they finally, it's like the old line, they kept moving the line until they found the line was 38 feet beyond the cliff. And you don't know. I mean, one of the things I think that was in the legislation last year was to put, I think the SEC, Christy may be able to tell me, was required to do a survey of the use of SPEs in corporate America, how extensive they were, and give sort of a sense of what they were. And we're trying to, I think people are still trying to figure that out. But there may well be in some of some very outrageous things, some very, at best ephemeral things. That would be the nice way to put it.
Before my question, I wanted to tell Rebecca, as someone who does what you do and is wading through big Pilgrim's Progress, you might be interested to know that the term muckraker was coined by Teddy Roosevelt at the 1908
Inaugural.
cornerstone laying. No, the cornerstone laying of the Longworth office building.
That's what it was, okay.
That's where the term muckraker came from. Pilgrim's Progress, the man with the muckrake, who was oblivious to his heavenly gifts. But my question for you both is, to what extent were there efforts to influence you in your reporting once you got underway, either by Enron or by people representing Enron, or to what extent were forces influencing you, such as the competitive media, that interfered with you telling the best story you could tell, the quickest and best way you could tell it, whether they were calculated to do that or not?
And, my gut answer is there weren't. I mean, I think for one thing,
Trying to influence you?
well, I think you would expect, for example, pushback from Enron, wouldn't you? I mean, that's what I would expect. But I think Enron was so dazed by what was happening to it that they never did launch a good defense. They were without the master magician, Jeff Skilling, at the time the story broke. Ken Lay was not up to the task of explaining why the company had gotten to the place it had, clearly. Andy Fastow, shortly after this starts, is gone. And there's a point in time where we now know one of Ken Lay's senior aides calls Fastow and says, "We're getting killed by the Journal. We need some of your documents." And he says, "I'm sorry, I've resigned my positions from LJM2. I no longer have them." So here's the company being caught in a position of not having the documents it feels it needs to understand, let alone defend itself. So I'd say we never got the pushback from them. I never felt any. Did you? From anybody particularly?
Just you.
Just me.
The Enron actually had a very unusual and odd response when we first started doing this, which was they stonewalled us. Now, if you know Enron, that is very unusual because they really prided themselves on their ability to handle, quote unquote, the media. And Skilling, of course, was the master handler because he would, as Becky can tell you better than I, just bury you in factoids and assertions and, you don't get that? What kind of idiot are you? And so we sort of expected that Enron would bury us in helpfulness, which was, of course, not helpful. And we put in requests, when we got close enough to sort of think we had some stuff to ask for an interview. Enron did an unusual thing then. They asked us for written questions. And of course, that's a whole big issue in journalism. How do you deal with written questions? And Becky and I had an argument about that, or at least a bit of an argument. But we sent questions.
It was a normal Punch and Judy day for us.
Right. I actually won that argument. So I remember it. But so we sent the questions, and I was fully. Sent us back a one-paragraph response. It was actually less informative than whatever they put in their SEC file. Becky was quite sort of upset that we'd done all those questions and said, "I told you so."
I felt we tipped our hand too much, that it was unnecessary, that sending them something less than a roadmap of everything we knew about LJM in the form of these questions, something less than that might have elicited something.
But to me, it was actually in some ways the most powerful statement they could have made, because expecting Enron to come and bury us with information and assurances and all that, when they came back and said nothing, that perhaps more than anything else up to that point told me there was something big going on inside of Enron. Something so big they were afraid to talk about it.
Joe?
Speaking of tensions or interference or what have you, were you during this period of covering the story, were you completely insulated? I guess you are generally completely insulated from the op-ed section of the journal. I know they're considered very separate, but I would think that the op-ed section didn't have quite the same take that the news operation did. Was there internal tensions there? Any?
Yeah, we have no contact with the
They're
editorial
crazies. There's a complete firewall, believe me.
My most extensive contact with the editorial page is I used to play, when I was in the New York Bureau, I used to regularly play racquetball with one of the editorial page writers, and used to take a lot of satisfaction from routinely beating him because he was awful. But no, the journal has a huge wall that, actually I don't think I think the editorial page people would deign to talk to us because I think they think we're uneducatable. But so no, there was none of that. Although I must say, for the editorial page's defense, they've been fairly hard on the whole Enron thing. They've certainly been very critical of the banks, particularly Morgan and Citibank, as these sort of almost corrupt enablers that, allowed Enron, and they were vital to Enron building the financial artifice that it did.
They fed the habit.
And they said the editorial page is this oddity that they believe in free market capitalism, but they also believe that if you break the rules, if you lie and cheat, that the market should punish you. That you should be pummeled, and in extremists, we should actually have to call in the government, that's a pretty extremist for the editorial page, and put them in jail. So, the journal's editorial page, my sense was offended by what happened at Enron and with some of those big corporations.
Yes.
What role did the high prices in the California spot market for electricity play in your investigation? I mean, did you see that as a clue that something was wrong given Enron's role in the California market, or were you looking just at the stock prices later on? Because the prices went crazy from...
Yeah, I mean, my job is national energy reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So that previous year, in fact, Jeff Skilling resigns in August of 2001. The entire from May of 2000 until that point, I was just completely wiped out and dominated by the California energy crisis. And we both live in California, so we experienced firsthand. And I'd been covering energy in California since 1995, so I watched the state put together its deregulation plan. So certainly we were very much aware, and John and I first began working together when the electricity crisis became too large a story for me to handle alone. So certainly very aware of Enron, but of course, as you know, there was a lot about Enron's involvement in that market that was unknown until the Death Star, Get Shorty, and all those and many other memos came to light when Enron waived its attorney-client privilege. So I really, until we had that documentary evidence, I found it impossible to believe that Enron and some of the other traders were doing what they were doing. It is so morally reprehensible to me to think that people would do what they did, just regardless of the consequences of the state of California. I don't understand that.
It was made before that the Enron story is sort of the Watergate story for the business press. Watergate stimulated a lot of interest in young reporters to go into the news business and cover government, which seemed to be reformed and transformed for a while. But there was Iran-Contra, and now we have another story on why did we go to war in Iraq. So there's a lot to report. Rebecca, you mentioned personal responsibility. Is that story over now with Enron, or should young reporters go into the business press because there will be, down the road, more Enrons? What's your take on the street these days?
Well, I think there always will be more stories of graft and corruption. I mean, that is part of the human experience, right? And I don't think you go into journalism. I mean, I understand there were a lot that went in post-Watergate. I mean, I think you go into it because it's interesting. Every day brings you something new. I mean, it's a stimulating career. It's fun. It's socially useful. I think those are reasons enough to go into it.
I mean, I think given human nature, the basic structure of the marketplace, Enron partly did what it did because the marketplace likes, almost demands in ways where we always like to see happy results. We like to see growth. We like to see, this quarter 15% above the year ago quarter. Those demands don't go away. They're still there. And, those kind of things have been there through, at least most of the last several hundred years. You can go back to the tulip mania of the 1600s in Holland and the South Sea bubble of England in the 1700s. Now, you can pick your century and you can find your schemes and scams and frenzies. Because human nature, doesn't change as fast as technology. We just do it faster now on a bigger scale. But the motives are still there, and they're still out there. Right now, the marketplace in corporate America has had a big kick in the head. So there's a lot of, hangover.
But I don't think, investment banking is one area I think has not been reformed. I think they're getting by, almost getting off scot-free at this point. They're throwing some money in. That's not been touched, really. I don't think in fundamental ways.
We have time for a few more questions, and sir in the back.
The events you cover in 24 days are just so fast and furious, and your book takes a kind of a retrospective look. But going forward, where do you see the story evolving? More specifically, it seems pretty clear that Ken Lay was the amiable know-nothing, or was he? And Jeff Skilling, clearly nobody believed on August 15th that he was quitting for personal reasons, which led you on your hunt. Where do you see the story going in the future? Will we see culpability beyond Andy Fastow?
One thing we've learned from earlier periods like the insider trading scandals in the 1980s is it can take prosecutors years and years to put these cases together. And those cases were probably not as complicated as Enron. The other challenge with Enron is if you bring a case, you have to be able to explain it to a jury. That's very challenging. I mean, they nearly lost the obstruction of justice case against Arthur Andersen. They really won it on a fluke. So I think they're being extremely painstaking. They don't want to bring charges against Jeff Skilling or Ken Lay and lose. And they've learned that it pays to be cautious. I don't think we're at the end. I'm sure there will be more. I mean, I feel there will be more charges. Whether it will include those two gentlemen or not, I don't know. But
one of the perversities of the Enron story, in a sense, is that we may look back on it and find that there's lots of things we've learned about that you're going to say, God, that should have been a crime. But it may not be a crime. Because one of the things that the prosecutors are running into as they're doing their investigations is what you could call the expert defense. In other words, Enron had outside accountants, they had outside lawyers passing on vast amounts of this business and saying it was okay, you could construct this legal argument or this accounting argument and you can do that. And what we now see is people like Arthur Andersen looks like they would be saying yes to almost anything. So the fundamental job of the outside auditor that was set up for was to sort of be a representative and help protect the public. Have to be a brake on corporate behavior. It looks like Arthur Andersen basically completely fell down in that, but it gives a lot of the Enron executives on a lot of their transactions cover to say, well, how can you say I had criminal intent if my auditors told me it was legal? So, what they've so far gotten Andy Fastow, what they've indicted him on, are more traditional fraud charges where they're saying, you didn't tell the auditors crucial information, or you lied to your board of directors about this, or you cheated some of your partners in one of the partnerships.
and put money in your son's bank accounts.
Yeah. So those are more garden variety fraud cases. It will be interesting to see if they can ever sort of pierce that expert's defense or whether they try. But we may end up finding that one of the greatest lessons of Enron is, that the failure of the internal systems, the systems we'd set up to kind of help ensure honesty in corporate behavior just fell down on the job and may let some of these people off.
One thing I wanted to just mention, whether 24 days becomes the equivalent of all the president's men or not, I think it's the reason that there's so much attention drawn to them. It's an example of a story that from a reporter's point of view is unbelievable and almost too good to be true, that it keeps going and unraveling and unraveling. And I think we mentioned before how this stands up long term. Many young people today are really riveted by the Enron concept because it's an example. There's a lot going on we don't understand, but this is really wrong, and here are some specific things that were wrong. And it's something that, as difficult as it is, you can grab onto. And the strength of your reporting and 24 Days is it explains how you try to unravel that and how you follow a story that is unbelievable. And I think in that way, I think that's how the book can really have an impact in terms of young journalists.
You know, and you asked a question earlier about how do old reporters cover things differently than young reporters. And one thing I have learned over the years, after more than 25 years at this, is there is care and feeding of a story. I mean, you really can keep feeding the beast in a lot of ways and keep the information coming, and you can sustain a story, I think, much better as an older reporter than as a younger one. You learn to pace things a little differently because you want to keep it moving and progressing.
Could you tell us about anything you did in terms of using what you were reporting to prompt stuff to come out, to prompt more sources to come up with more information?
Well, the best was the herd on the street. I mean, that was like, it worked so well. It was so gratifying. Is there another you can think of?
It was modestly embarrassing, but we sometimes got tips when we missed something.
True. Yeah.
The second day after the earnings, Enron had done a classically Enron thing. They had some bad news. They had to reduce their shareholders' equity by $1.2 billion because of the LJM partnership. And rather than sort of, as some people suggested, put a filing with the SEC to just announce that, or even putting it in their earnings press release, which other people recommended, Ken Lay decided to mention it in one quick sentence in their, conference call they have every quarter with the analysts after the earnings, and sort of like, look, and sort of like say, so they can say, well, we said it. And, everybody practically missed it. And so we missed it from the first day story, and a helpful short seller, always very helpful people, called us up and said, hey, you idiots, you missed this big story. And so that night we did a story about the $1.2 billion equity reduction, which we got credit for breaking some new news, even though we missed it in the first place. And actually, it turned out that the actual equity reduction itself was not nearly as important as the fact that the people started perceiving that they'd hidden it. And the act of seemingly hiding it was far more damaging to Enron than it ever would have been just announcing it. Which again goes back to this notion is, fess up to it. If you got a problem, just admit it and say it and deal with it. Because Enron found that by hiding it, suddenly, oh my God, what else are they hiding? Oh my God, are they lying to 1.2 billion this and what this, and so
pretty soon it's real money, right? Yeah.
And then that story brought on another set of documents. Somebody else called and said, well, I got more for you. So it sort of started feeding on itself. And you never know. I mean, you sometimes read a story and you think, God, this is going to have a gigantic impact. And it falls off into a cliff and you never hear from it again.
Let's take 2 more questions, and then I hope that you'll stick around afterwards, and if you want to ask them more questions later, please do so. So 2 more questions. Let's get you, actually let's do 3 more. You, then you, then you, and that will be it.
With these sources who drop information to you or drop a dime for you, are they generally people who are just offended by the dishonesty, or are they looking for something on their own, even though they might be unidentified sources? And you didn't get it from me, but here's the thing. Are they looking for some gratification, some evil gratification of their own?
We have both. Most people have, their motives for calling the press, vary. Some people are really just, good citizens and offended. Most people have somewhat baser motives. They want to make money. They're really pissed off at somebody. They want revenge. you know, and you have to realize that. You know, and my years of reporting, I sort of come to the conclusion that in some ways a person's motives are less important than the quality of their information. And I've gotten really rotten information from saintly people. And it's no good to me because you can't print really rotten information. On the other hand, I've gotten really useful, accurate information from people I wouldn't stay on the same side of the street with. So in some ways, you start ending up trying to evaluate the information almost more than you're evaluating the person, their motives, because on one hand, you never really know the motives. It helps, and we've certainly felt more comfortable with our original source, that both of us felt that this person really was trying to do the right thing. You know, we didn't know for sure, but that's the sense, the person never really overstated stuff. The person, you know, they didn't start going off into diatribes about, you know, Andy Fastow and the CIA and, you know, the kind of things you sometimes get from people who are obsessed. So that helped, but that wouldn't have been enough by itself.
This was your deep throat?
Or a sore throat.
I always care about motivation. I really do. Because I don't want to see the newspaper used. So I'm always defensively, you know, that's why I like short sellers. Don't like them. Can't help it, don't like them.
John, you had mentioned that not enough reporters read the financial statements all the time. And do you think in hindsight that if reporters had read the Enron financial statements more thoroughly before all of this happened, that they would have figured out these things, or were they just so obscure and odd that and made up that no one would have found it out?
I think a lot of it was so obscure and odd that reporters probably couldn't have deciphered a lot of it. I couldn't decipher it. But you know, I sometimes do wonder, they were putting out mentions of these LJM partnerships for 2 years, you know, prior to August 2001. So you wonder if somebody had said, you know, had run across it a year earlier and put something out, would, you know, a source have called. It could have just, you know, put something in the paper and it dies. You know, stories do have their moments. Sometimes you do the exact same story, you know, now, nothing happens. You do that same story 6 months later, a year later, all hell breaks loose. So you don't know, but I think, you know, the job of a journalist isn't so much to necessarily say, I can do this or that. Your job is to say, okay, here's something that looks like it's news. I found it. I'm going to put it out there and see what happens. A lot of times, nothing happens. That's part of the curse of journalism.
Well, as a beat reporter, and when the story broke, the question was, where was the press? Where were the beat reporters? Well, I'm the beat reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Gee, what an uncomfortable position to be in a lot of ways, because it was a question, why didn't I read that? Why didn't I ask questions about it? And I didn't. And the answer is, I get dozens and dozens of SEC documents every month. And in a lot of respects, you find what you look for. I mean, I'm always so buried in these documents, trying to find things that, so it's kind of a mea culpa for me, because I wish I'd found it and asked a question, although my gut says to me, it would have led to nothing. They'd have tied me in knots, or they'd have given an explanation that would have basically, you know, it would have led to nothing. That's my conviction. But we'll never know.
I can personally
and I'll
tell you,
always wonder.
Rebecca has no unwillingness to read deep and impenetrable documents. She read things about the California electricity crisis I barely want to lift up. So,
Sir, last question.
Yeah, I just wondered if the Journal or any other major publication has surveyed business schools to see what has been the effect of Enron and all the WorldCom and other stories on their curricula. I would imagine that some of them at least would raise the emphasis on business ethics.
that's an interesting question. I don't know if the Journal doing it.
I don't think we've surveyed it, but I think there's a general perception that certainly the MBA students now are spending more time talking about ethics than they have in a long time.
I know, Rebecca.
Certainly J schools are.
You got invited to one, was it J school or B school for that? I got invited to the UC Irvine Business School. They had a whole course they did on Enron, a 5 or 6 part course on Enron. And I don't know, that was just, you know, one instance, but other schools might have. And I found there was a very big turnout. There people seemed very interested in the issues raised.
And in the whole subject of corporate governance. Go ahead, Andrew.
Ethics, and also I found at UC Berkeley and Boston University a great interest in accounting that was never considered such an exciting area, both for business journalists. It's one of the things we're doing at the American Press Institute is helping journalists understand accounting in these areas, but also people who studied business in a little different way, and maybe even there might be a few other Ken Lays out there who didn't look as closely at some of the areas that they might have. So accounting is one of the more popular courses around the country these days, and I'm sure this sort of effect has been, everybody's realized the importance of it.
Rebecca, John, Andrew, thank you very much, and thank you, and hope you stick around for more questions afterwards.
Thank you.
Rebecca Smith and John Emshwiller won the 2002 Gerald Loeb Award for their newspaper coverage of Enron. 24 Days is published by Harper Business. For more information, go online to harpercollins.com.